Good afternoon. You are in the right place. Welcome to Pearson's webinar titled Supporting the Participation of Autistic Children and Young Adults, a panel discussion with occupational therapy thought leaders. We're so glad to have you. Next slide. So first off, a few details. This webinar is being held in honor of Occupational Therapy Month. We're coming to the end of a great OT month. The annual AOTA conference was last week. I had the pleasure of attending, as I know many of you also did. We want to wish all the OTs, OTAs, and OT students in attendance today a very happy OT month. The topic of our webinar today is to provide an overview of a few current areas of research and innovations targeted towards optimizing participation for autistic children and young people. Our speakers will cover topics that are relevant across childhood and adolescence. We are fortunate to have a panel of 3 occupational therapy thought leaders who will present their work today. After the 3 short presentations, we welcome questions for our panel members. Please feel free to write your questions in the Q&A section of the platform. We'll try to answer as many as we can. We also just want to note briefly that this webinar is eligible for continuing education credits through AOTA as well as NASP and APA. Next slide. So I am thrilled to announce our esteemed presenter panel, but first I'll introduce myself. My name is Elizabeth Munsell. I'm a research director for Pearson, specializing in development of occupational therapy clinical assessments. I'm a clinical occupational therapist and have a doctorate in rehabilitation sciences, and I'm excited to be serving as our moderator for our discussion today. Our first presenter is Jessica Kramer. She's an associate professor in the Department of Occupational Therapy at the University of Florida. Dr. Kramer's research draws upon theoretical concepts and methodologies from occupational therapy, disability studies, education, and rehabilitation to 1, partner with youth with intellectual and developmental disabilities in the development of evaluation of rehabilitation products. 2, develop community-based interventions that equip youth with IDD and their families with the skills to identify and resolve environmental barriers to participation. And 3, design high-quality patient-reported outcome measures using contemporary measurement approaches. Our next presenter is Lauren Little. Dr. Little serves as Associate Dean of Research in the College of Health Sciences at Rush University. Dr. Little studies innovative delivery models to support young children and their family with neurodevelopmental conditions. Her current work focuses on health inequities among under-resourced families and children and gaps to access and care. And last but certainly not least, our final presenter is Anna Wallisch. Dr. Wallisch is an assistant research professor at Juniper Gardens Children's Project. Dr. Wallisch's research is driven by her clinical experiences as an OT and answering the concerns of families. Her research focuses on examining mechanisms underlying challenging eating behaviors in young children with autism to develop future interventions, utilizing technology for advancements in intervention delivery and contextually relevant measurement, and the early identification of children with neurodevelopmental diagnoses. All right, next slide, please. So that's who you'll be hearing from today, but before we begin, we'd love to know a bit more about you. So please take a moment to respond to 3 poll questions. Our first poll question is, are you an occupational therapist, speech therapist, psychologist, or other? And if you're a student, go ahead and select the discipline that you're studying. We'll give you just a minute to respond to our questions. We're seeing some answers come in. Great, it looks like we have a nice variability in our participants today. We've got lots of OTs, lots of psychologists, and a couple speech therapists too. And those other, we'd love to hear who you are. Feel free to type that into the chat if you're interested. We'll move on to our next question. So our next question is, where is your primary work setting? And you can advance the slide. Do you work in a school, an outpatient center, in a hospital, in the community, or somewhere else? Oh, great. We've got a lot of school-based therapists here today. We also have 12% outpatient center and some community-based therapists and professionals and 9% other. Thank you so much for those answers. Our last question is, you can advance the slide. What age group do you primarily work with? We have birth to preschool, elementary age children, adolescents, or young adults, or adults. We're not seeing the poll come through, but I'm seeing some people respond in the Q&A, adolescents, elementary age students.
I do apologize. For some reason, it's not launching this last poll.
That's all right. We're getting a lot of feedback in the chat. This is great. Thank you everybody for jumping in. Wow, great. I'm seeing a lot of elementary age students come in. So that's great. Like I mentioned, our talks today will range from young children all the way through adolescence and young adulthood. Fabulous. Great. Well, thank you. It's great to know a bit more about who's participating in our discussion. So now you can advance the slide. Without further ado, I'd like to pass the mic over to Dr. Jessica Kramer, who will be speaking to us about Project Team, the game plan for participation.
Welcome, everybody. I am thrilled to see so many school-based practitioners here today, and also people working with adolescents. I'm hoping those two things go together because Project Team hopefully will be a great resource for the young adults that you serve. Next slide, please. And next slide. I just want to acknowledge that Project Team received funding from the National Institute on Disability, Independent Living, and Rehabilitation Research, and was created at Boston University and currently hosted by UF. Next slide, please. So today you're going to describe how autistic teens and young adults can use the game plan, which is a problem-solving process, to identify and resolve environmental barriers to participation. So Project Team is really about teaching young adults and teens to think like an OT. Next slide. I want to acknowledge also that Project Team, and part of its magic is that it was developed in partnership now many years ago with a group of, at the time, teenagers with a range of disabilities, including some who identified as autistic. They contributed to the conceptualization of the problem-solving process and even the activities within the manualized materials. Next slide. So I am preaching to the choir a little bit here, but you may be aware that a common approach to thinking about disability and participation is to assume that impairments with motor, sensory, or cognitive functions lead to difficulties or reduced participation in a range of contexts, including schoolwork and the community. However, Project Team uses an alternative approach. Next slide. And that alternative approach is focused on thinking about the environment. So regardless of my current body structures and functions, if I have an environment that's set up to be a barrier, maybe there are tight spaces, a noisy, sensory, overwhelming environment, and materials that are confusing, or someone who's talking too fast like me, then I'm going to have difficulties fully participating in that activity. However, if we flip it on our head and think like OTs, next slide, please, We can use environmental supports or modify that environment to resolve those participation challenges and enable young people to do activities right now, today, to meet their goals and to fully participate, regardless of their body structures and functions. Next slide. So Project Team does this and teaches young people how to do that themselves. This is really important because if you're in school, you know that IDEA requires us and teachers to provide full access to the environment. However, Project Team wants to teach young people to also think with that mindset. So they're equipped when they're done with school to identify those barriers and supports, to generate strategies to deal with those barriers and request the accommodations they need to fully engage. Next slide. So you're going to have the amazing opportunity in our next few minutes to walk through what we call the game plan. The game plan is the central component of Project Team intervention. The Project Team intervention includes a freely available, downloadable manual, both for the interventionist, which could be an occupational therapist, as well as a teacher or a psychologist, or even a paraprofessional. It also includes a workbook for young people. And part of that is teaching this game plan problem-solving process. The game plan problem-solving process is based on a goal, plan, do, check. This is a metacognitive strategy that's used broadly across our field as well as other fields. We know it works. Here we're using that goal, plan, do, check metacognitive strategy to help young adults internalize a process of identifying and resolving environmental barriers. Project Team and the game plan also utilize universal design for learning. So you're going to see that there are symbols, colors, and I can't make you do it because I can't see you, but also kinesthetic motions and movements that go with it. So when we get to our first base goal and we see something that looks like a target, a bullseye, it makes us think of a goal. So when we think about first base and our problem-solving process, we ask ourselves, what activity would I like to do? And we use a motion like a shoulder shrug or a question. Next slide, please. Next, we get to our planning phase. We have to think about how we're going to identify and resolve those barriers. Plan step 1, ask the question, what parts of the environment help me or make it hard for me? Next slide, please. In the Project Team curriculum, young people learn about 11 different parts of the environment. It includes physical, attitudinal, and sensory aspects of the environment, and recognizes that environment can be both a support and a barrier. And in the game plan problem-solving process, there's a checklist. There are many activities in Project Team that help people learn throughout the curriculum how to identify these different components of our environment. Next slide. Now that we know what our environmental barriers are, we need to move to plan step 2, which is what strategy can I use to change the environment? Next slide. Project Team introduces 6 modification strategies. A modification strategy is a thought or an idea that you can use to change your environment. In Project Team, some of these strategies are about external factors, but also maybe thinking of some internal factors that help us deal with it. For example, if we have a barrier, we might be able to resolve that barrier by changing spaces or changing the rules or using technology. But we can also do things like plan ahead or ask for help or teach other people about our abilities and needs. Next slide, please. All right, plan step 3, we identified our barriers. We have a strategy that we think might work. We want to start thinking it through. But using the strategy, change the activity for other people. We want to make sure that if we're changing the activity, it works for us and it also continues to work for other people for optimal success. Next slide. All right, so we've just got through second base. We're now on third base, do. We have our plan and we have to execute it. So we ask ourselves the question, Who do I talk to about making this change? Next slide. In Project Team, we want to instill an initial introductory understanding of laws that give people with disabilities the right to ask for accommodations. We don't go in depth. This is considered an introductory training that once young people understand these laws would potentially be explored in depth in some of the incredible training and advocacy programs that exist at the state level. So they learn about Americans with Disabilities Act, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, and the Rehab Act. And they learn very basically that these rights, these laws give them the right to be included in their neighborhood and community, school, and in places and programs run by the government. Next slide, please. The do phase also includes a script for advocating or asking for these changes or these strategies. You'll see that we use those symbols that we've used throughout Project Team to make it very easy for young people to build their script using the previous problem-solving steps that they've already thought of. They're going to state their goal. They're going to describe the barrier and the strategy that they want to use. Next slide. And finally, we have to check and make sure that what we did worked, and we ask ourselves, can I do this activity now? And we check it off our list. Next slide. There is a lot of initial evidence for Project Team. I'm going to summarize it here, and there are also about 7 to 8 references available in the literature. So in Project Team, and it was studied, we compared people completing Project Team to people who were in a goal-setting group. So they identified a participation level goal, and they received prompts to achieve their goal, but they didn't complete the whole curriculum, and they didn't learn this problem-solving process. The people who were in the Project Team group, there are a greater percentage of those who had intellectual disabilities compared to the goal-setting only group. However, they demonstrated increased problem-solving, increased self-determination, and attained more goals over time than that goal-setting only group. We also learned that youth with disabilities can be effective peer mentors. I haven't mentioned it yet, but a component of Project Team is peer mentoring from other young adults with disabilities to young adults completing the Project Team curriculum. It's an amazing opportunity for young adults to build pre-vocational skills, self-advocacy skills, and positive development for themselves and their disability identity. And finally, we heard that both parents and youth felt that Project Team fostered independence and empowerment and was relevant to both their current and their future lives as they prepared for adulthood. Next slide. So here's that evidence. Hopefully, if you have those handouts or you can get access to them, you'll be able to link to those references. Next slide. Thank you. I know this was a fast and furious introduction. I encourage everyone to visit the Yale Lab website where you can learn more about Project Team and request a free download of materials.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Kramer. I'm really looking forward to some discussion on the game plan at the end of the webinar. Just a reminder to please send in your questions through the Q&A section of the platform. Up next, please welcome Dr. Little, who will be speaking on sensory processing and strengths among autistic children.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for logging on. And I mean, just what an amazing honor to share this time with you all. Next slide, please. So we're going to be talking about sensory processing and strengths among autistic children. Next slide. The objective for our short time together is that I would love for you all to be able to explain how sensory processing and knowledge related to sensory processing can be integral in promoting strengths among autistic children. Next slide. Excuse me. So terminology can be a little confusing because individuals from different fields, for example, OT versus neuroscience, often use different words to describe similar behaviors. And there is a significant body of research that suggests that individuals with autism respond differently to sensory information. But when I'm talking about sensory processing today, I want us to know and to really kind of reflect that sensory processing is about everyone. And the term sensory processing differences and sensory features are used to describe all people's sensory experiences. Again, we know that children with autism and those with ADHD might show distinct sensory processing patterns, but instead of thinking of these as a dysfunction or abnormalities or deficits, I instead will refer to them as features or differences. Next slide. So just as a quick reminder, I've seen how many of you are on from different practice settings, and it's so amazing. I'm sure this is just a brief reminder, but sensory processing is how an individual detects sensory information from the environment and then regulates the behavioral responses associated with such sensory information. Next slide. And sensory processing patterns occur when behaviors kind of group together or cluster together. So for example, we all have sensory processing patterns, and these combinations of behaviors reflect the ways that we detect and respond to sensory information. Many of us may be sensitive to sounds or smells, versus some of us might not notice loud noises. Next slide. So as just a little exercise, I would love for you to, look at this image or close your eyes for a minute and just imagine that you are at a loud, crowded concert. It is dark, except for the lights coming from the stage. The large speaker is next to you, and you can feel the vibrations of the music through the room, and you can smell the perfume on your friend next to you. People begin clapping. The crowd is swaying. Now, for some of you, this scenario might have sounded really fun, right? Maybe you've done something like this recently. Maybe you really like to do it. And for others of you, this sounds like a bad idea. Too loud, too crowded, too close. Based on how you reacted to this scenario, I can understand your sensory processing preferences. So how you choose to live your daily life, the way that you design your routines, the way that you decide to spend your leisure time, this is all influenced by your sensory processing preferences and aversions. It's partly how your nervous system is structured, and it really influences how you live. Next slide. So one of the things that we've been doing recently in our work is ensuring that we hear autistic self-advocate perspectives and really engage stakeholders when we're thinking through sensory processing and other kind of topics. And this is from a recent Willard and Spackman chapter about sensory processing. For autistics and other neurodivergent individuals, modern environments that serve communities of people can be hotbeds of sensory nightmares. Harsh burning lights, eardrum breaking noise echoing off of hard surfaces, an olfactory assault of heavy caustic scents, being forced to hug or touch hands when greeting someone, and more. It shouldn't come as a surprise when an autistic child has a meltdown while having to endure such nerve-wracking sensory overload. Yet very little is done with respect to prevention and preparation. Next slide. So when we think of sensory processing and when we think of this as a part of a person, learning occurs when we notice stimuli but are not overwhelmed by it. For many of us in our daily lives, and for many of those children that we serve, we have to, going back to the autistic self-advocate, think about how we best create environments that are the best matches for individuals, and then how we can create learning opportunities based on those personal sensory processing preferences and aversions and the characteristics of that space. Next slide. So the purpose of our intervention strategies is always to promote participation and adapt environments to meet children's sensory processing preferences and aversions. I love to hear Dr. Kramer's talk prior to mine just now to think so much about environmental modifications. There's research that shows our sensory processing patterns are pretty stable throughout our lives. For example, if you were an avoidant child, a sensory avoidant child, chances are you might not be a sensory seeking adult. Many of us, including those with autism, have pretty stable sensory processing patterns. Next slide. So I am going to highlight some of the strengths among common sensory processing patterns and how we characterize those. For individuals that used to be called low registration, we can think of individuals as bystanders. Bystanders are very easygoing. They can go with the flow, but they might need a little extra input to participate. Some of our early research shows that bystanders as children, autistic children, actually participate in more community outings than avoiders or sensitive children because they are so easygoing. But those community places might have to be a little more intense or they might need some extra cues to participate. Next slide. So seekers are in need of intense experiences to focus and learn. As adults, we all know some sensory seekers. They're often, they complete triathlons. Sensory seekers might have bright lights in their office. They might have incense burning. And so for seekers in the classroom, we can think of these children that they need to multitask. They need that movement. And we can best match our activities for a seeker to meet that need instead of saying, sit in this chair only, right? Because they need that movement to learn. Next slide. And for the avoider, avoiders can be very detail-oriented, and they can complete those detail-oriented tasks without difficulty. Avoiders like order and they like control. So for example, if we're talking about having avoiders in the classroom, maybe they are sitting in the front row, right? Because they can't be distracted from the back row of having everything up in front of them. Maybe they would like to complete some tasks with the teacher. Visual schedules, we know those are great for avoiders because they have to know what's next. And then we can have the child possibly choose their chair, choose their lighting, choose what area of the room they would like to sit in. Next slide. And sensors are discerning in all they do. Sensors like to observe before they participate because they want choices. For a classroom, for example, a sensor might want increased physical space. They might want to observe the activity before they participate, and they're really going to need time to warm up. For a sensor to, put them into an activity right away that might involve a lot of movement or a lot of crowded space, it's not going to be a great match of an activity for a sensor. So we have to think about what are the sensor strengths and how can we create that activity that best meets what they are good at. Next slide. And one of the things that I always like to remember, and I would invite you to consider, is that individuals can show us or tell us what works best for them. Oftentimes, children are already creating their own spaces, they're choosing their own activities, and it might be up to us to just notice or talk with them if we can about their sensory preferences and aversions to understand what activities are a good match and how can we draw on their strengths to participate in those activities. The research also suggests that when we coach teachers and parents to understand the child's sensory processing preferences and notice those things, then those teachers and parents can gain self-efficacy by using effective strategies to understand that these aren't characteristics that we need to change within the child, but we just need to find the right match for the child. Next slide. So in thinking about how those that we serve tell us what they need, this is an autistic self-advocate perspective. Parents and professionals focus so much on deficits, distress, and low sensory thresholds that they miss out on the intrinsic elements of being autistic. Despite the best of intentions, they may unwittingly cause the very circumstances leading to a response they're trying to prevent, such as meltdowns. An autistic child who enjoys the feel of a shoelace and uses it to stim would find it much more difficult to tolerate hostile sensory environments if the shoelace was prohibited in favor of a more socially acceptable method. Next slide. And then the autistic self-advocate goes on to say, stimming is a natural and healthy response and serves many vital purposes. Some stims and sensory needs can actually lead to lifelong pursuits as a hobby or a career. For example, a young adult who stims using dough-like textures and items may find a career in pottery or masonry later in life. Another with high sensitivity for sound might possibly decide to study sound engineering or another audio career. What might be a painful, miserable sensitivity to sound for one person might be the catalyst behind another's exceptional linguistic aptitude, acting talent, musical ability, or engineering expertise. Yet, if stims and sensory needs are contravened through the desire to fix them, such endeavors may never be realized. Next slide. So I invite you to consider how we conceptualize sensory processing among those we serve, and how we might best create environments and activities that match individual sensory processing patterns. Thanks so much for listening.
Thank you, Dr. Little, for a great presentation highlighting sensory processing and strengths of autistic young people and all of us. As a reminder, we've gotten a few questions come through. Please continue to add your questions to the Q&A box for us to answer after the last presentation. And now for our final presentation, Dr. Wallisch will discuss naturalistic mealtime observations of autistic children and caregivers. Take it away, Dr. Wallisch.
Thanks so much for having me today. I'm really honored to be here, especially with Elizabeth, Jessica, and Lauren. Such a great panel. Next slide, please. So I have really been interested in eating behaviors in autism, and I became interested in this topic when I was actually in OT school, and I was working with the first little boy I ever worked with autism, and his mom had packed his lunch. It had noodles that were buttered with a little bit of cheese on top, which was his favorite. She always knew he would eat it. But he came home that day and she opened up his lunchbox and he hadn't had any of it. And when she asked him, oh no, like, why didn't you eat your lunch today? He said, because the cheese slightly melted, because the noodles were warm when she packed it. And this mom had so many questions about, why is this? Why is it hard for me to find new foods for him to enjoy or to pack in his lunch? And so, as an OT student, what I did is I went to Google Scholar, tried to look for evidence, and I couldn't find great research on it. So that's what got me interested in this, is how I can best support parents. And then also as I was in my program, I also supported families via telehealth. And one of the things that we realized too was that a lot of families had goals related to mealtime because it was so stressful for them. Next slide. So this is actually one of the quotes from one of the parents, and we know that mealtime in general is very stressful for parents with a young child with autism. And this is what one parent said: "We're concerned he is too skinny, like we're worried about his health. I mean, every day I open the fridge and I'm thinking, what am I going to feed this kid today? That is the hardest part. It's stressful on top of everything else." And a lot of parents feel like they're not meeting their child's basic need with feeding. And the research is still emerging, but I really wanted to be able to better support families. Next slide. So to provide some background, we know that these challenging eating behaviors are highly prevalent with autism, with up to 83% of children with autism exhibiting these eating behaviors. Next slide. We also know, and I think that we can all agree, that a diet solely of buttered noodles with cheese on top is not probably the most balanced diet. So there is about a 41% greater risk for developing obesity in autism as compared to neurotypical children. Next slide. There are also a lot of serious health consequences associated with these eating behaviors, and a lot of them often start in early childhood, but can persist into adulthood. So one of these is about 22 to 26% of individuals with anorexia nervosa also have a diagnosis of autism. So there can be health consequences of obesity, but also eating disorders later in life. Next slide. And then I think what is especially unsettling is there was a couple of recent articles that came out that suggested that parents of children with autism are 1.5 to 2 times more likely to experience food insecurities compared to parents with neurotypical children. And I think about this with mealtime already being something that's really stressful for families, and then thinking about food waste or how you're going to put food on the table could only make things even more stressful. Next slide. So I wanted to go into some of our preliminary studies. So first, one of the things that we wanted to look at was underlying mechanisms related to eating behaviors. We started with using eye tracking to look at attentional biases to foods. And this is because there's a lot of models of obesity that hypothesize that, when individuals with different types of eating conditions, they often preferentially attend to food stimuli. And in turn, these kind of biases to this food is thought to maintain some of those eating behaviors. There was actually a really interesting intervention study that was done on obesity with young children, and they actually found that eye tracking predicted treatment response to that obesity intervention. So when children had more attentional biases towards food before the intervention, they had less weight loss during the obesity intervention. But we don't really know what some of these attentional biases look like or the role that they play within autism and eating. And then through this study, though, of course, this started in December 2019. So we had to shift and work on remote eye tracking. So this is still in the works, and I hope to share more with you later. But we did mealtime observations, and then I'll describe some of our descriptive data too. Next slide. So this was a recent article that came out, and our sample was 62 parents with a young child who is 3 to 6 years of age with autism. And all of the parents identified their child as a picky eater. And what we did is we used the sensory profile, and we specifically used the oral processing subscale to divide children into groups. So whether they were in the oral sensitive group or an oral non-sensitive group. Next slide. And then we use the Behavioral Pediatric Feeding Assessment Scale, which provides subscales on food acceptance, medical or oral motor skills, child mealtime behaviors, parent strategies at mealtime, and parent negative feelings at mealtime. And what we found was that children with oral hypersensitivity, they had more issues with food acceptance, which I think after hearing Dr. Little's presentation makes sense. But we also found that parents had more negative feelings related to mealtime as compared to the non-oral sensitive group. And I think it's those negative feelings that parents had that I became really interested in the importance of those parent-child interactions during mealtime and how we can best support those. Next slide. So in autism, we know, as I said, that mealtime is really stressful for families, and parents often make a lot of accommodations to support their child. And sometimes they can even choose foods that prevent the triggering of a specific behavior. In other research within different pediatric weight-related conditions, there is also a clear link between parent and child behaviors during mealtime. So a lot of times when stressed, parents may use more forceful or coercive types of prompts, which are, of course, very, very well intentioned, because all parents want is for their child to eat, or to eat a new food and to try it. But unfortunately, some of these more forceful types of strategies can be counterproductive to food acceptance from the child or a healthy weight status. Next slide. So this is what got me interested in this idea of interpersonal physiological synchrony, which is just a very fancy word for the dynamic kind of co-regulation of behaviors that we see between a parent and a child, and then their physiology also matching that as well. So physiological synchrony, when it does occur, it is known to positively influence a child's self-regulation and promote cognitive development. It is also strong parent-child relationships, and when parents show stronger parental sensitivity to their child, it's also linked to more physiological synchrony and can actually help to modulate a child's response to a stressor. But if physiological synchrony is low, sometimes parent stress can actually spread to their child. So in instances of parent anxiety and stress, which we know is very common within these meal times with children with autism, that parents tend to use strategies that could override a child's cues. It's also interesting, I think, even as therapists, we've felt this before too, that sometimes if we're having a really strong interaction with families, a lot of times our physiology, whether it be our heart rate or our electrodermal activity, is actually in sync and kind of going in the same direction, which I think is really interesting. Next slide. So there's few studies, if any, in autism that have really looked at physiological synchrony during mealtime. But there is some research that does suggest that in general, children with autism show less synchrony with their parents. And then there's also research within autism that suggests that parents may use more compensatory strategies during interactions with their child. So since parent behavior is very malleable, and there are certain parent strategies that can protect healthy eating, like reinforcing and positive types of prompts, we really wanted to understand some of those parent-child interactions along with their physiology to determine what strategies parents are using that are resulting in these strong interactions and this physiological synchrony, and how can we then build upon some of those strategies that we're seeing. Next slide. So really quickly, just so you can see what it looks like, these are the sensors that we use to, they measure both heart rate variability as well as electrodermal activity, which is just a fancy word for the sweat of your skin. Next slide. So this is very, very, very preliminary, but I wanted to show you kind of what some of this looks like. So on the left side, you can see this is their EDA, or their electrodermal activity levels during mealtime. And then on the right side, it's play to kind of compare the two conditions. And in the orange is the child with autism, and then in the kind of blue color is the caregiver. And I think what's interesting here is with physiological synchrony, you're typically looking for the two lines to be going in the same direction. And with mealtime, we see that at the very beginning, the child's waiting for food. And in this specific instance, the parent provided preferred foods. And then you can see kind of halfway through that a non-preferred food is introduced. And I think what's interesting here is if you zoomed in really closely, you'd see kind of a small increase in the electrodermal activity of the child, but you see that they start to go in opposite directions here. And it actually, the arousal level of the caregiver is what we see increasing. Whereas in the play condition, we see that those lines are much more similar and going in the same direction when they're having that really strong and positive interaction together. Next slide. So I think in addition to the stress that parents experience, I think that there's also that high variability that we see with children. So this was also another telehealth family, and she said, he only eats chicken fries from Burger King. He used to eat a lot of foods and he just doesn't eat them anymore. He used to eat strawberries, then he started refusing those. He used to eat bananas, then he started refusing those. I wish I could get him to eat more. And I think that, what's interesting here is that this child had a wider range of foods that they were accepting, and then it started to narrow further. So I think it brings the question to me of what was it that changed? And a lot of these changes and accepting of foods can occur really suddenly, which can be really frustrating for families when they had maybe 5 foods that they knew that their child would eat, and now it's down to 4 or 3 foods. Next slide. So one method that can be used to assess this is ecological momentary assessment, which gives us a lot of those real-time information and a lot of information. So you can do it more than one time a day. And what we're looking at is how parent stress, parent affect, child affect before the meal actually influence what the child ends up eating during the meal. So this is also soon to come, but hoping to answer some of those questions of why we see those sudden changes and what the child is accepting. Next slide. And of course, the future goals for all of this is we really want to develop personalized strategies that are going to work for the parent and the child and pull those moments that we're seeing those strong interactions during mealtime and how we can build upon those to support families. Next slide. And of course, I have to thank my mentorship team, Ann Davis, Brian Boyd, Christopher Cushing, Matthew Goodwin, our statistical consultant, Waylon Howard, and then all of the families and children who participated in this study, as well as our funding sources. So thank you.
Great, thank you, Dr. Wallisch, and thank you to all our presenters for sharing your research. Now we would like to open up this discussion to some questions from our audience. We've received several questions, so we'll start with those. I am going ahead and I'll direct the first question to Dr. Wallisch. Anna, we had a terminology question for you. Can you please specify what an attentional bias towards or against food might look like and how we could apply that in determining food preferences or feeding treatment?
Yes, that's a great question. And so with eye tracking, what we're specifically looking at for attentional biases is which foods they're looking at and how long they're looking at it. So if you have a bias towards it, it means that if you're looking around a room, you might really find the food more interesting. And it's also the eye tracking allows us to see some of those really small movements that we may not even be aware of as well. But I think with food preferences, it kind of gives us an understanding of even some of those quick judgments that we make automatically with foods. And I think even it can provide parents even a better understanding of maybe some of the foods that their child might be interested in. But yeah, that's a great question. And thank you for asking too.
Okay, one more follow-up for you, Anna. Someone from our audience said, when I encounter or diagnose avoidant restrictive food intake disorder and even problematic subclinical levels of eating problems, I generally refer the child, teen, adult to a psychologist who specializes in eating disorders and has an understanding of autism. Should I be referring to an OT for ARFID first or concurrently? A prior OT advised the window for treatment via OT closes after around age 8. Can you speak to that?
I think an OT would be a great resource, especially like Lauren even talked about understanding a lot of the sensory processing influences within the eating behavior. Also, psychologists are fantastic within the eating disorder realm. And I know that for a lot of families, it's really hard to find a provider that specializes in both autism and eating disorders. So I think that there should be a lot of OTs even that have some of that specialty as well.
Thank you. And then one more for you, Anna. There's a lot of interest in your research, and people are asking how can we follow you? How can we follow the new publications you have, what you're working on?
Oh, well, you guys are too kind. It's very flattering, and I sometimes I always wonder if my research is only interesting to me and I'm overly interested in it. So I'm excited that you all are interested in it too. But email me. Anyone who is interested in it, please. I'll put my email in the chat too. And Elizabeth, will it also be on the handout as well?
I don't think we have included emails on the handout, but please feel free to Google Anna. She'll come up. You can get her institutional email through the website.
You can get it through there. And then Google Scholar is also an easy way to follow too. But yeah, always email and stay in touch too, because I could talk about this all day.
Awesome. Yeah, it always feels good to have other people interested in your research. I agree. Okay, moving on to Lauren. Lauren, we had a couple questions around terminology for you as well. First, kind of together, we had a question, what are STIMs? And then another person asked that said this is the first time they're hearing new terminology around bystanders, seekers, avoiders, and sensors. And was a study done to change this terminology?
Yeah, so we can start with the STIMs, and I apologize, I should have defined that. So self-stimulatory behavior, this is often conceptualized as a repetitive behavior that to an outsider appears to serve no apparent purpose. The difficulty with that definition is that we don't know the purpose, and a lot of autistic adults have told us that there was a purpose to this behavior, and that now that they're adults, they can tell us that as children, they were told to stop that behavior and not engage in it. It was labeled as maladaptive, when in fact for them, it was adaptive. It was serving a purpose, but they couldn't express that purpose to us. So that's a STIM, a self-stimulatory behavior. And with regard to terminology related to bystanders, seekers, avoiders, and sensors, this is just kind of an easy way to conceptualize those four sensory processing patterns. Bystanders, what used to be called low registration, seekers, sensory seeking, avoiders, sensory avoidance, and sensors, sensory sensitivity. So if you're familiar with Dunn's sensory processing model, those are kind of the four quadrants.
Thank you. We have a follow-up question about that. So with a mix of seekers and avoiders in the same preschool space, how can we better meet all of their needs?
Great question. Great question. So I would ask, and I see is Linda asked this question. I would ask, maybe consider how that space is structured and where you might notice particular children hanging out in different spaces. Before I was an OT, I was a preschool teacher for a couple of years. And I think, even before I knew what sensory processing was, I would notice that child spends a lot of time at the water table, right? They really like their hands in that water, versus this other child tends to spend a lot of time in the library, where it's very quiet. And so I think that those mixes of children and their preferences, maybe we do decide that the library is that quiet space, and maybe if the seeker needs to read, we have a therapy ball where they're bouncing on the therapy ball reading. So just kind of using your powers of observation to understand how those particular spaces support those particular children.
Thanks, Lauren. It looks like we have time for maybe one or two more questions. We had an interesting question come up about the sensory profile, and Lauren, Anna, Jessica, you all could probably speak to this. The question was, Lots of times I've seen results from sensory assessments, such as the sensory profile, that appear to be internally inconsistent. So for example, a child described as a sensory seeker who is also oversensitive to multiple types of sensations. How, as OTs or professionals, do we conceptualize this? Lauren, let's start with you.
So Anna and I have done some work together in this, and I'm sure for some of you all listening, you say, well, I'm a sensory seeker. You know, I love roller coasters, but I am not trying that new food, right? So we all have differences related to sensory processing modalities, such as like oral. Maybe some of you love loud music, but you're not going on that roller coaster. It's very common. And so we have done a couple of studies looking at what is called sensory subtypes or sensory profiles. Please, if you're interested in kind of some of these overlaps or intersections of different sensory processing patterns within person, email, and I'm happy to share some of that research with you all. And so I can also put my email in the chat, and again, happy to share any of that.
Great. I think we'll have time for one more question. So last question here is, let me see, gotta make sure that we're getting everything. Okay, so sensory is such a hot topic. How can we address this when teachers and all types of staff believe something is sensory when it's simply a child's preference? And then sort of related to that, what do you recommend for OT practitioners who work with other professionals that are really focused on changing sensory patterns? How do we sort of influence the perspective of professionals in this area?
I had a meeting with my daughter's teacher recently. My daughter is a sensory seeker, and her teacher wore all black shirt, black pants to the meeting. And I invited her teacher to consider her own sensory processing patterns, because I was able to guess in the moment that she was a sensor because she was wearing all one color, as I also do. And so I think one of the superpowers that we have as OTs is to invite others to consider their own sensory processing patterns and how it's part of humanity, which influences everything that we do in our daily lives. And when we don't pathologize it that way, it just can become part of a kind of non-threatening discussion.
Thank you. I love the conversation across the different presenters around the role of environment and really sort of reframing, thinking about environment as it impacts our participation in the world. Let's see, maybe we can squeeze in one more question. Jessica, how did partnering with youth with disabilities, including autistic youth, influence the design of the game plan?
That's great, thank you. So one of the challenges that we encountered when thinking about the game plan was that final planning step, thinking about implications for others. I felt very strongly from a disability rights perspective that you had a right to request an accommodation, and that was it, period. But through the lived experience of the young adults who did have experience advocating, they shared that unfortunately, whether it's fair or not, if they advocated and it impacted others in a negative way, it also had sometimes negative social ramifications for them. So thinking really strategic, again, not saying that's fair or okay, but it's a reality that they brought to the table. And making that more explicit, and a role of an OT could be to help think that through or modify that so everyone benefits from the modification.
That's awesome. What an invaluable experience. That's great. Well, we are at time now. I want to just thank everybody for attending this webinar in honor of OT Month and for contributing to a great discussion. Keep an eye out in your email for any upcoming events from Pearson, and we really hope to see you again soon. Take care.